The electrician who arrived at 171 Lake Washington Boulevard in Seattle on the morning of April 8, 1994, was there to install a security system. He climbed the stairs to the greenhouse above the garage. He saw what appeared to be a person lying on the floor. He assumed the person was asleep. He went back to his van and called his employer. His employer told him to look again. He looked again. Kurt Donald Cobain was 27 years old. He had been dead for approximately 3 days. The note he had written was nearby, addressed not to his wife or his daughter or his bandmates or his manager or the millions of people who had purchased his records, but to Boda, his imaginary childhood friend from Aberdeen, Washington. The person he had invented as a small boy when the real world around him had become too difficult to navigate without something that would simply listen. That detail, the imaginary childhood friend, is the key to this entire story. Not the music, not the MTV specials, not Nevermind and the 25 million copies it sold, not the flannel shirts and the torn jeans and the generation that claimed him as its mouthpiece. The key is the small boy in Aberdeen who needed an imaginary friend to survive his own childhood and who grew up to be the most famous musician of his generation and who still, at the end, addressed his final words not to the world that worshipped him, but to the companion he had invented because the world around him was too lonely to face alone. This is the story of Kurt Cobain, not the icon, not the slacker messiah, not the reluctant voice of a generation. The story of a boy who was broken before he was famous, and what fame did to someone who was already broken, and why the pressure and the adoration and the noise of it all could not reach the place inside him where the wound actually lived. Stay with me through all of it, because in this documentary, I'm going to tell you 4 things about Kurt Cobain that most people who grew up with his music, who wore the t-shirts, who know every word to Lithium, who understand exactly why Something in the Way sounds the way it does, have never fully connected. I'm going to tell you about the fracture that opened in Aberdeen when he was 9 years old and that shaped every decision he made from that moment forward. I'm going to tell you about the physical pain, the chronic, documented, medically real stomach condition. That was the original reason he turned to heroin, and that most people have never heard the full story of. I'm going to tell you about the specific way that fame, rather than saving him from what he was carrying, made it heavier. And the 4th thing, I will tell you when we get there. If you leave before the end, you miss the truth about what Kurt Cobain's suicide note actually says, and what it reveals about what he was really asking for in the weeks before he died. I will tell you when each revelation arrives. Don't go anywhere. Aberdeen. Remember that name. Aberdeen, Washington. Remember that name. Because Kurt Cobain carried Aberdeen inside him every day of his life, in the way he flinched from being looked at too directly, in the way he dressed as if he was trying to disappear into a crowd, in the way he built songs out of the specific emotional texture of a town that the rest of the country forgot the moment it stopped needing the timber that the town produced. Aberdeen sits at the mouth of the Chehalis River on the southwest coast of Washington state, about 100 miles south of Seattle. It is a logging town. It was built on timber and maintained on timber. And when the timber industry began its long decline in the latter half of the 20th century, Aberdeen felt it in the way that mill towns feel economic contraction, in the bodies of men who lost work and didn't know what to do with themselves, in the bars that stayed busy when the mills went quiet, in the specific kind of resignation that settles into a community that was built around one industry and has watched that industry leave. February 20th, 1967. Kurt Donald Cobain is born at Grays Harbor Community Hospital in Aberdeen. His father, Donald, is a Chevron station mechanic. His mother, Wendy, is a homemaker. They live in a small rental house, first in the nearby town of Hoquiam, then moving to Aberdeen when Kurt is a few months old. The neighborhood is working class in the specific Pacific Northwest way. The houses have porches and yards and the smell of rain and pine, and the people who live in them work with their hands and take their weekends seriously and do not generally go in for the kind of self-examination that might complicate their relationship with the life they have. Kurt, by all early accounts, was a happy child. A wild, creative, endlessly energetic small boy who drew constantly, who sang constantly, who hammered on a Mickey Mouse drum set his parents bought him, who discovered at an absurdly young age that making noise, specifically musical noise, was the most interesting thing a person could do. His mother Wendy described him as a child with unusual emotional sensitivity, a boy who felt things more intensely than the other children around him, and who expressed those feelings in bursts of creativity that sometimes alarmed and always impressed the adults around him. His Aunt Marie played guitar. His uncles were into rock and roll. The family's musical DNA ran through both sides, and in Kurt it expressed itself with a concentration that suggested something larger than casual talent. By the time he was in elementary school, he had already decided, with the specific certainty that children sometimes have about their own futures, that music was what he was going to do with his life. And then 1975 arrived, and everything changed. Kurt was 8 years old when his parents' marriage ended. His father Donald and his mother Wendy divorced after what biographer Charles R. Cross, in his essential biography of Cobain, Heavier Than Heaven, described as years of growing incompatibility between two people who had married young in a small town and discovered, as the years passed, that they wanted different things from life. For many children, parental divorce is a painful but eventually manageable event, something that reshapes the household but does not fundamentally alter who the child is becoming. For Kurt Cobain, the divorce was, as Cross documented, an emotional holocaust. His mother remembered that he seemed, overnight, to become a different child. The happy, creative boy, who sang constantly and drew constantly, became withdrawn. His grades fell. He began bouncing between his mother's house and his father's house with the specific instability of a child who doesn't have a stable center of gravity in either place. When his mother remarried, the new household dynamics made him feel secondary, left behind, unsure of whether he was truly wanted or simply present by default. When his father remarried too and his stepmother brought her own children into the home, Kurt began to wonder, in the way that sensitive children conduct entire internal proceedings about things they would never say out loud, whether he had been replaced, whether the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally had done the math and determined that other arrangements were preferable. He wrote something on his bedroom wall during those years, a rhyme, 4 lines. He wrote, "I hate mom, I hate dad. Dad hates mom, mom hates dad. It simply makes you want to be so sad." A child wrote that. A child with enough emotional intelligence to understand what was happening to him and enough creative instinct to put it into words and enough hurt to write it on the wall where he could see it. That child grew up to write the songs that defined a generation's experience of alienation, of not belonging, of feeling like the world had been organized around everyone except you. And every one of those songs came from the same place that rhyme came from, the bedroom wall in Aberdeen. The boy who felt abandoned before he understood what abandonment was. He was placed on Ritalin briefly, for hyperactivity. He began to disassociate himself from family members. He shuffled between relatives, uncles, grandparents, family friends who agreed to take him in for a while. He told people later that he lived with so many different family members in those years that he lost count of which house was supposed to be home. He found, in those years of shuffling and displacement, the thing that would both save him and eventually become part of what consumed him. He found rock and roll, not just any rock and roll, the kind that Aberdeen's geography pushed him toward, the heavy, distorted, uncompromising kind, influenced by the Seattle scene that was beginning to coalesce a few hours north, influenced by bands like the Melvins, who played with an intentional heaviness that felt like an appropriate response to the weight Aberdeen placed on you just by being Aberdeen. He found punk rock, and in punk rock he found a philosophy that felt designed specifically for what he was experiencing. The explicit rejection of the mainstream, of the polished and the commercial and the expected, of everything that the adult world seemed to value while simultaneously failing the people who were supposed to benefit from its values. He dropped out of high school in 1985, 2 weeks before graduation. He moved out of his mother's house. He crashed with friends. He rented a series of what he described as dilapidated houses in Aberdeen and the surrounding area. There is a documented period during which he was homeless, sleeping under a bridge near the Wishkah River. That bridge. That specific bridge that he would later reference in a song, in the specific way that artists process the experiences that shaped them, by turning them into sound and giving the sound to the world. He worked as a janitor. He worked other odd jobs. He practiced guitar obsessively. He played music with a lanky bassist named Chris Novoselic, who had grown up in the same cultural landscape of the Pacific Northwest, and who understood what Kurt was trying to do without requiring extensive explanation. Aberdeen had given him his wound. Aberdeen had also given him his sound. And in the late 1980s, he began carrying both of them north toward Seattle, not knowing that the combination, the wound and the sound, was about to change everything. The underground and the build, the Seattle music scene of the late 1980s, was one of those specific cultural moments that only become visible in retrospect. At the time, it was simply a collection of bands in a rainy city, playing shows in small venues, sharing practice spaces, recording on cheap equipment, operating in a subculture that had its own aesthetic logic and its own rules and its own contempt for the mainstream industry that existed in Los Angeles and New York, and treated what was happening in Seattle as a curiosity, if it noticed it at all. Kurt and Chris, with a rotating cast of drummers, began recording as Nirvana in 1987. The name was Kurt's choice, and it was characteristically loaded with meaning. Nirvana, the Buddhist concept of transcendence, of release from the cycle of suffering, of the state beyond desire and attachment and pain. A name chosen by a young man from Aberdeen who was carrying considerable desire and considerable attachment and considerable pain, and who perhaps understood even then that the music was his attempt at the thing the name described. Their 1989 debut album, Bleach, released on the independent Seattle label Sub Pop for $606 in recording costs, was loud, raw, deliberately ugly in places, full of the specific aesthetic of the Pacific Northwest underground. Heavy guitar, relatively simple song structures, a directness of emotion that the more polished mainstream rock of the era had spent years carefully engineering out of its product. Bleach sold around 40,000 copies initially, enough to build a small touring circuit, enough to establish Nirvana as a genuine presence in the underground, not enough to pay rent comfortably or to suggest to anyone paying attention that what was coming next was going to change the world. What changed everything was the drummer. In 1990, Dave Grohl auditioned for Nirvana. He was 21 years old, from Virginia, a musician of extraordinary precision and power who brought to the band something it had been missing, a rhythmic foundation, solid enough to hold up whatever Kurt was going to build on top of it. The three of them, Kurt, Chris, Dave, had an immediate chemistry that was audible from the first practice session. Something locked into place. DGC Records, a division of Geffen, signed Nirvana in 1991. They entered Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California, with producer Butch Vig to record the album that would become Nevermind. Kurt arrived with a collection of songs that had been gestating in the specific conditions of his life: the divorce, the homelessness, the ache of Aberdeen, the discovery of punk rock, the underground years, songs that carried all of that, but that also had something else. Something that Butch Vig recognized immediately: melody, hooks, the structural bones of pop music buried inside the noise, like finding something warm and recognizable in the middle of something that was supposed to be confrontational. Smells Like Teen Spirit was recorded in those sessions. A song that begins with a guitar riff, builds through verses that are almost mumbled. Kurt specifically said he wrote the lyrics in a way that would obscure them, that he admired REM. Is Michael Steep for his ability to deliver emotional impact without clarity of lyric, and then explodes in a chorus that somehow manages to be both incoherent and precise, both nihilistic and anthemic, simultaneously a rejection of everything the mainstream represented and the most infectious thing the mainstream had heard in years. Nevermind was released on September 24, 1991. DGC had modest expectations. They pressed 250,000 copies for the initial run, which was respectable for a band coming from the underground, but not suggestive of a commercial breakthrough. Within weeks, those 250,000 copies were gone. By January 1992, Nevermind had knocked Michael Jackson's Dangerous off the #1 spot on the Billboard 200. Michael Jackson, who had been the most famous entertainer on earth for a decade, was displaced at the top of the charts by a 24-year-old kid from a homeless period in Aberdeen who had recorded the album for under $250,000 and who was. At the moment, his record went to #1. Reportedly not entirely sure how he felt about it. The album would go on to sell approximately 30 million copies worldwide. It is one of the best-selling records in history. It is in the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry. Rolling Stone has placed it among the greatest albums ever made. In 1991, rock criticism had not had an event like this in decades. A genuinely underground, genuinely independent aesthetic sensibility breaking through to global commercial dominance in a way that simultaneously validated and potentially destroyed everything it represented. Kurt Cobain was 24 years old. He was the most talked about musician in the world. He was about to discover what that meant. Revelation number 1. The wound was already there. The fame didn't create it, it illuminated it. Here comes the first revelation. Pay close attention. Most narratives about Kurt Cobain describe his psychological deterioration as a consequence of fame, as if the pressure of being the voice of a generation created in him a damage that hadn't previously existed. This is the comfortable version of the story. It assigns cause and effect in a way that makes the tragedy feel like an accident, a thing that happened to him rather than a thing that was already in him before the world knew his name. The truth is harder than that. The fracture in Kurt Cobain's psychology was established in Aberdeen in 1975, when he was 8 years old and his parents' marriage ended, and the world he had been living inside, the small, warm, predictable world of a happy childhood in a Pacific Northwest logging town, shattered in ways that nobody around him had the tools or the awareness to address. He did not receive therapy. He did not receive any formal psychological support. He was bounced between households while his parents navigated their own grief and anger and new relationships, and the sensitive, intensely feeling child in the middle of all of this processed his abandonment the only way available to him. He internalized it, expressed it through art, and built around it a wall of irony and detachment and dark humor that allowed him to function while keeping the wound invisible to casual inspection. He was, by multiple accounts from people who knew him well, one of the funniest people they had ever met. Brilliantly, absurdly, darkly funny. The humor and the pain lived in the same place in him, as they often do in people who learned early that the only safe way to express vulnerability was through the armor of comedy. Biographer Charles R. Cross spent years interviewing hundreds of people who knew Kurt at every stage of his life. His conclusion, documented throughout Heavier Than Heaven, was that the divorce and its aftermath did not simply cause Kurt to become depressed. It fundamentally reorganized his sense of what the world was, what could be relied upon, who could be trusted, whether safety was genuinely possible, or simply an illusion that more honest circumstances would eventually strip away. He developed what psychologists would recognize as an attachment style shaped by early loss and inconsistency, a style characterized by simultaneous, intense desire for connection and deep-seated expectation that the connection would ultimately fail or be withdrawn. He wanted to be loved unconditionally, and he believed, in some foundational way, that unconditional love was not a thing the world reliably offered. What fame did to this psychology was not break it. What fame did was scale it. The boy from Aberdeen who felt watched, scrutinized, judged, who wrote on his bedroom wall about hating his parents, who felt like a burden in every household he passed through, became the most scrutinized person in popular music. The introvert who found human interaction exhausting and who had always preferred a small number of genuine relationships to the performative warmth of large social settings was suddenly required to give himself to stadiums full of strangers who wanted a piece of what he represented. The person who had spent his entire life trying to be authentic, who had built his entire artistic identity around the rejection of pretense, around the principle that the worst thing a person could be was fake, was now the face of a commercial enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars, being used to sell albums and concert tickets and merchandise and the cultural brand of a generation's supposed alienation. He said in 1993, "I'm not going to pretend that I'm having a good time. I hate the way things are going. I hate the way we've been consumed." He said, "The worst crime is faking it." He said, "I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I am not." These were not casual observations. These were the statements of a man who had organized his entire life around authenticity as a survival strategy, who had made of honesty a religion, and who was watching the machinery of fame process his honest art into something commercial and packaged and distributed to people who, however genuine their emotional response, could not actually see the person behind it, who were loving Kurt Cobain, the icon, Not the boy from Aberdeen who had slept under the Wishka River Bridge, and who still, at 26, woke up in the middle of the night with the specific anxiety of a child who doesn't know where he's going to be living next year. The body in pain. Before we go further, there is something you need to understand about Kurt Cobain's daily life that most people have never heard the full story of. It is the second revelation, and it is the one that makes his relationship with heroin comprehensible in a way that the standard narrative of rock star excess does not. Kurt Cobain had a chronic, severe stomach condition that had been plaguing him since his teens. He described it in his journals, the extensive personal writings that he kept throughout his life, as a burning, persistent pain in his stomach and lower chest that could, on bad days, make it difficult to function. He tried to describe it to doctors. He saw multiple physicians who failed to identify the source. He was tested, examined, advised. The pain did not go away. He wrote about the pain obsessively in his journals. He wrote that it had made him think about dying, not in a melodramatic way, in the specific, matter-of-fact way of someone who is describing what chronic pain actually does to a person's relationship with the idea of continuing. He wrote that the pain was so bad, for so long, that the idea of relief through any means had become appealing in ways he recognized as dangerous. And then he found heroin. He was not seeking oblivion. He was not seeking the rock star experience of drug use as performance of excess. He was seeking, specifically and deliberately, the cessation of a physical pain that nothing else had managed to address. He wrote explicitly that the heroin worked, that for the first time in years, the stomach pain subsided when he used, that he could eat, that he could function, that the constant background hum of physical suffering that had been his companion for nearly a decade went quiet when the drug was in his system. "I've had this terrible stomach problem for years," he told people, in various forms, in various interviews, "and I've found something that relieves it." He first experimented with heroin in 1987, when he was 20 years old. By the fall of 1991, as Nevermind was becoming the most important album in the world, his use had shifted from occasional to daily, not because he was chasing a high, because the pain kept coming back, and the drug kept making it stop, and the deal that his body had struck with the substance was one that his mind, carrying its own separate history of pain, was not inclined to renegotiate. In 1992, during Nirvana's world tour, Kurt found that access to heroin was severely limited in certain countries. The stomach pain returned with full force. He consulted a physician who prescribed methadone, a long-acting opioid used in addiction treatment, as a substitute. The methadone addressed the pain sufficiently to get through the tour. When he returned to the United States, he went back to heroin. Later, in a rehabilitation context, he was given buprenorphine, then an experimental treatment, and wrote in his journal that the buprenorphine alleviates the pain within minutes, and that he had been on a decreasing dose for 9 months without a single stomach episode. He found it almost miraculous. He wanted to tell people about it. He believed it might be the thing that finally broke the cycle. But the perception of buprenorphine at the time, both in treatment settings and in the broader culture, was complicated. It was a stigmatized substance. It looked to people who didn't understand the pharmacology, like simply substituting one addiction for another. And for Kurt Cobain, who had built his identity on authenticity and on the rejection of pretense, the internal conflict about whether taking a medication to manage his pain constituted sobriety or constituted another form of the problem he was trying to escape was something he struggled with without resolution. This matters enormously, because the standard version of the Kurt Cobain story presents his heroin use as the behavior of a self-destructive rock star, as the archetypal excess of the 27 Club, as a choice made from darkness and nihilism. The fuller version is more complicated, more human, and ultimately more heartbreaking. It is the story of a person in physical pain who found the only thing that worked and who could not find a medically sanctioned path to the same relief that his doctors and his culture and his own internalized beliefs about authenticity would allow him to accept. He was in pain. He found something that stopped the pain, and the world that was supposed to help him find a better answer kept failing him. Perhaps you have known someone like this. Perhaps you have watched someone manage a chronic condition, physical or psychological, with the tools they could actually access, rather than the ones that might have been better. Perhaps you understand the specific exhaustion of being in constant pain, and having the people around you see the symptom, the behavior, the substance, the coping, rather than the wound underneath it. That is who Kurt Cobain was in the middle of the famous years. A person in physical pain, in psychological pain accumulated since 1975, handed the most scrutinized platform in popular music and trying to manage all of it with tools that were gradually making everything worse. The marriage and the acceleration. In 1991, Kurt met Courtney Love at a club in Portland, Oregon. Their relationship was, by every account that exists of it, volcanic. They were both musicians, both intensely creative, both carrying significant personal histories, both operating at a level of raw emotional intensity that people in their orbit found simultaneously compelling and destabilizing. They fought with ferocity and reconciled with equal ferocity. They pushed each other toward work and pulled each other into chaos with no apparent preference between the two. They married on February 24, 1992 in Hawaii. Kurt wore pajamas. It was, in its own way, a completely appropriate image. The most famous rock musician in the world, marrying in pajamas, as if to insist even at his own wedding that the ceremony would happen on his terms and that the terms would be deliberately, pointedly unceremonious. Their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born on August 18, 1992. Kurt's response to fatherhood was, by multiple accounts, immediate and profound. He was overcome by it. He wrote about Frances with a tenderness that was different in register from everything else in his journals. Quieter, cleaner, free of the irony that armored most of his public and private expressions. He loved her with the specific, desperate love of someone who had grown up feeling inadequately loved, who had internalized the message that love was conditional and uncertain, and who was now holding in his arms a person for whom he intended the opposite experience entirely. He wrote about wanting to be sober for her, about wanting to be present for her in the way that his own father had not been present for him, about the future he imagined, the ordinary domestic future, the quiet house, the breakfast in the morning, the school runs, the unremarkable continuity of a life that did not require him to be Kurt Cobain from Nirvana every waking moment of it. He was, simultaneously, incapable of accessing that life and deeply committed to trying to reach it. The fame made it structurally impossible, because the quieter he tried to become, the more he resisted the media, refused interviews, declined invitations to perform the persona of rock superstardom, the louder the machinery around him became. Record labels, management companies, promoters, the entire infrastructure of an industry that had built its quarterly projections on the continued commercial output of Kurt Cobain's creativity. All of it exerted a constant gravitational pull toward more. More touring, more press, more albums, more product, more Kurt Cobain. And Kurt Cobain, who had never wanted to be a product, who had written "Corporate magazines still suck" on his arm during a photo shoot, and posed for a t-shirt that said, "Corporate rock still sucks," found himself at the center of the most commercially successful machine in popular music and unable to locate the exit. In 1992, at the height of Nirvana's commercial success, Kurt said, "I feel like we've been sucked into the mainstream, and I do feel a little sick about it. I knew that once I was popular, I'd lose some of my identity. From a person for whom identity, the authentic, unperformed, stripped of everything false core of who he actually was not just important, but existentially central. For whom the loss of that identity was not a metaphor, but a genuine crisis. The machinery kept running, and Kurt kept disappearing into it. Revelation number 2, the physical pain, was real, documented, and never properly treated. I need to stop here and emphasize something that the previous section only touched on. Kurt Cobain's stomach condition was not a cover story. It was not a rationalization invented after the fact to explain drug use that had other causes. It is documented in his journals, which were written privately, for himself, before anyone understood what they would eventually become, in the years before Nevermind, before the fame, before heroin was even a regular part of his life. The pain came first. He described the sensation in detail, the burning, the nausea, the way it would come and go without apparent cause, the way it would spike in moments of stress or performance anxiety, the way it had already, by the time he was 20, made him consider ending his life during its worst episodes, not from depression or nihilism, but from the simple calculation that a person in sufficient unrelenting pain will eventually reach the point of considering whether continued existence is worth the price. He sought medical help repeatedly. The medical help consistently failed him. Part of this was the limitations of the medical understanding of his specific condition at the time. Part of it was the complicating factor that, once the heroin was in the picture, doctors he saw were inclined to attribute all symptoms to the drug use rather than investigating the underlying condition the drug was treating. This is a pattern that anyone familiar with addiction medicine will recognize. The person presents with physical symptoms. The physical symptoms are attributed to the substance. The substance is attributed to self-destructive behavior. The self-destructive behavior is attributed to character flaws. And the original wound, the thing that drove the person to the substance in the first place, goes uninvestigated and untreated because the substance has become the organizing story. Kurt was trapped in this pattern for years, and the people around him, who loved him, who were genuinely frightened for him, who organized interventions and rehabilitation placements and expressed their concern in every way available to them, were, despite the best of intentions, often participating in a framework that treated the symptom rather than the source. The closest he came to a medical resolution, the buprenorphine treatment that he wrote about with such hope in his journals, was stigmatized and misunderstood by the treatment culture of the early 1990s in ways that prevented him from maintaining it as a legitimate, supported component of his recovery. This is not a footnote. This is structural. The physical pain was a driver of the drug use. The drug use was a driver of the dysfunction. The dysfunction was the thing that the interventions were targeting, and the thing that was causing all of it, the chronic stomach condition, never definitively diagnosed, never effectively treated by conventional medicine, remained in the background, doing its work, while everyone focused on the visible behavior it had produced. The fall of 1993, the last good months. In November 1993, Nirvana appeared at Sony Music Studios in New York to record an episode of MTV Unplugged. The Unplugged format, acoustic, stripped down, intimate, was in its commercial heyday in the early 1990s, having produced major career moments for a variety of artists. But what Nirvana did with it was different from anything the format had previously generated. Kurt arrived with a specific vision for the set. He didn't want to play Nirvana's hits acoustically, the obvious, expected approach. He wanted to play songs from other artists, Leadbelly, David Bowie, the Meat Puppets. He wanted white lilies and black candles on the stage, decor that more than one observer noted felt funereal. He surrounded the set with flowers in a configuration that he said reminded him of a funeral. The director of the broadcast told him the flowers were a strange choice. Kurt said he wanted it to look like a funeral. That detail, in retrospect, carries a weight that is difficult to sit with. But what matters in the moment, in November 1993, is what actually happened on that stage. Kurt Cobain performed "Where Did You Sleep Last Night?", a traditional Appalachian murder ballad recorded most famously by Leadbelly, as the final song of the set. He sang it with his head back and his eyes wide at the end, holding the last note until the sound faded, and then looked up at the ceiling for a moment before the audience erupted. People who were in the room described it as one of the most powerful live performances they had ever witnessed, not because of technical virtuosity, because of the specific emotional truth in his voice, a truth that operated below performance, that was not the carefully managed expression of a professional entertainer, but the raw output of a person in whom the song had found something to activate. He was 26 years old, less than 5 months from the day his body would be found in the greenhouse above the garage on Lake Washington Boulevard. But that night, in the Sony studios, something was working. Something in the music was still connecting him to the reason he had started. The discovery, in the poverty and displacement of Aberdeen, that sound could carry what ordinary language couldn't, that a song could do what a conversation couldn't, that a voice in a room could reach into people and touch something that their ordinary, defended, daily existence kept protected from ordinary contact. That capacity, the capacity to reach through sound into the interior of another person's experience, was the gift. And it was also the curse, because it required him to go to the interior. It required him to reach into the wound and pull something out and give it to the audience, every night, on tour, again and again, while the wound stayed open. The collapse begins. Rome, March 1994. Following a tour stop in Munich, Germany, on March 1st, 1994, Nirvana's final live performance, Kurt was diagnosed with severe bronchitis and laryngitis. The remaining European tour dates were not immediately cancelled. There was hope that he would recover quickly enough to continue. He flew to Rome to rest. On March 3rd, his wife Courtney flew to Rome to join him. On the morning of March 4th, she woke up and found him on the floor of their hotel room at the Westin Excelsior, unconscious. He had combined Rohypnol, a powerful sedative, with champagne. He was rushed to the hospital. He spent more than 20 hours in a coma. His management initially described the incident as accidental, a result of his exhaustion and illness. The circumstances of the incident, the combination of substances, and the state in which he was found have led to ongoing discussion about whether the Rome incident was an intentional attempt. His wife made statements years later suggesting she believed it was deliberate. The official finding at the time was accidental overdose. What is not in dispute is this: the man who was found on that floor in Rome was not primarily a drug user who had made a bad calculation. He was a person in severe psychological and physical distress who had been running on inadequate support for years, carrying a chronic condition that had never been properly treated, managing the pressure of being the most discussed musician in the world, and who had arrived in Rome in a state of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He regained consciousness. He was flown back to Seattle with Courtney and their daughter Frances. The rest of the European tour was cancelled. He came home to a house that was, by all accounts, not a peaceful place to recover in. The couple's relationship was under severe strain, complicated by the drug use, by Kurt's increasing withdrawal from the world, by the specific pressure that a life conducted entirely in public puts on the interior dynamics of a marriage. The people who cared about him were frightened. The Rome incident had made the severity of his condition impossible to minimize. An intervention was organized. On March 25, 1994, approximately 10 people gathered at the house. Musicians, record company representatives, friends, people who had known Kurt for years. They confronted him about the drug use, about the Rome incident, about the trajectory they could see clearly from the outside, even if he couldn't see it from where he was standing. Kurt reacted with fury. He insulted the people in the room. He locked himself upstairs. He told them, in various formulations, to leave him alone, that he knew what he was doing, that the problem was less severe than they imagined, that the interventions and the concerned faces were themselves a form of pressure he did not need more of. By the end of that day, something in him shifted. Perhaps the Rome floor. Perhaps Frances, who was not yet 2 years old and who was somewhere in the house. Perhaps the simple arithmetic of a body that had been abused beyond what it could sustain without intervention. He agreed to enter treatment. On March 28th, he enrolled in Exodus Recovery Center at Daniel Freeman Memorial Hospital in Marina del Rey, California. Courtney described her relief. She told a friend, "I was so proud of him." On March 30th, after approximately 2 days in the facility, Kurt Cobain climbed over the wall of the rehabilitation center, went to the airport, and flew back to Seattle. Revelation number 3. The last days were not chaos. They were silence. Here comes the third revelation. Listen carefully. The standard narrative of Kurt Cobain's final days presents them as the chaotic finale of a chaotic life. Frantic, dark, surrounded by crisis. The real picture, assembled from the accounts of the few people who saw him in those final days, is almost the opposite. After he returned to Seattle from the Exodus Center, his family and management were frantic. His mother filed a missing persons report. His wife, who had gone to Los Angeles, hired a private investigator named Tom Grant to find him. People drove to Neverland, not the Michael Jackson one, the Lake Washington house, and searched it. What they missed in their searching was that he was there, not in the house, in the greenhouse above the garage, alone. By all accounts constructed from the available evidence, Kurt Cobain spent his final days in a state that was not chaos. It was the specific, profound quiet of a person who has made a decision and is no longer in conflict about it. The frenetic internal war between the part of him that wanted to get better, to be present for Frances, to find the ordinary quiet life he had described in his journals, and the part of him that had been carrying the Aberdeen wound and the chronic pain and the weight of the fame for 27 years, and was running out of the capacity to keep carrying it, that war had, it appears, reached some form of conclusion. He had written in his journals months earlier, "I decided to kill myself or stop the pain. I bought a gun, but chose drugs instead." That sentence is not the statement of a person who is casually dark. It is the statement of a person who has been negotiating with this question for a long time, who has been choosing repeatedly to remain, and who was running out of reasons that felt sufficient. He had been given the tools that could have helped him. The buprenorphine that had eliminated his stomach pain, the rehabilitation center, the intervention, the people who organized themselves around him and said explicitly, "We see you, we know what's happening, we want to help." What he could not receive from any of those tools was the thing the intervention couldn't provide, the thing the rehabilitation center couldn't provide, the thing that the fame and the records and the 30 million copies of Nevermind and the adulation of a generation could not provide, the thing the boy in Aberdeen had written to his imaginary friend Boda about, the thing he addressed to Boda again at the end, was simple. It was not greatness. It was not legacy. It was not authenticity or the preservation of artistic integrity or any of the things that rock critics would later say he died for. It was peace. The specific peace of a person who is no longer required to be anything, who is no longer the voice of a generation, or the embodiment of a movement's contradiction, or the proof that authenticity could survive commerce, or the reluctant messiah of disillusioned youth, who is simply a person in a room, not performing, not carrying anything, not managing the gap between who he was and who the world needed him to be. He had felt it briefly in the music, in moments like the unplugged performance, in the early years when the music was still private and no one was watching. He had felt it in the mornings with Francis, the few clear mornings that he described in his journals with a tenderness that suggested he knew what he had in them. He could not reach it anymore, and he had been trying in every way he knew for years. The note addressed to Boda. On April 5, 1994, the date of his death, though his body would not be found until 3 days later, Kurt Cobain left a note. He addressed it to Boda, the imaginary childhood friend from Aberdeen, the companion he had invented in the displacement of his parents' divorce, in the shuffling between households, in the specific loneliness of a sensitive boy who felt things more intensely than the world around him was equipped to address. He addressed his final words not to the world, not to the millions of people who had made him their spokesperson, not to the industry or the critics or the generation that had claimed his work as its own, to a childhood companion that no one else could see or hear, who had been with him since before the fame, since before the music, since the moment in Aberdeen when the world first became too much, and he needed something that would simply exist alongside him without demanding anything. The note is documented, and its contents are a matter of public record. He wrote about the ethics of punk rock, about the way those ethics had shaped his understanding of what authentic art was supposed to be. He wrote that he had not felt the excitement of creating music for too many years. He wrote, "I feel guilty beyond words about these things." He wrote about the audience, about the people at Nirvana concerts who he could see experiencing genuine emotion, genuine release, genuine connection through the music. He wrote that he envied them, not for their ordinary lives, for their ability to feel what he had once felt in the music but could no longer access. He wrote, "I don't have the passion anymore, and so remember, it's better to burn out than to fade away." The line is borrowed from a Neil Young song, My Hey Hey. Kurt had performed it. He knew it. He chose it with full knowledge of where it came from. He closed, "Peace, love, empathy, Kurt Cobain." Peace, love, empathy, not rage, not nihilism, not the dark, destructive energy that the mythology of his death has sometimes been framed around. Peace, the thing he had been looking for since Aberdeen, the thing the fame had made it impossible to find through ordinary means. Love, for Francis, for the people in his life. Even in the note, even at the end, the love was there. The same love that had written about Francis in his journals with such tenderness, that had described the hope of ordinary fatherhood, that had been the most genuine emotion in a life that had been called upon to perform every emotion publicly for years. Empathy, the quality that had been his gift and his curse simultaneously, the ability to feel what other people felt, to translate human experience into sound, in ways that reached people precisely because the feeling was real. Empathy that had made the music great. Empathy that had made the world's pain feel personal to him in ways that had no obvious outlet. He was 27 years old. What the music knew, the songs knew. That is the thing about Kurt Cobain's catalog that becomes impossible to avoid once you understand the life behind it. Something in the Way, the last track on Nevermind, the quiet, minimal song that almost didn't make the album, is a song written from under a bridge. Literally or nearly literally, from the specific sensory experience of a young man who had been displaced from every household he passed through, and who had found, temporarily, a kind of peace in the structural shelter of a bridge over a river in Aberdeen. Cold water, the sound of it, the specific quality of existing in a place where no one is watching and no one expects anything. The bridge became a song. The song became part of an album that sold 30 million copies. And the experience of being underneath the bridge, the experience of being outside the world's demands, of existing without performance, of finding in displacement and poverty and the cold a kind of freedom that the complicated life inside houses had never provided. That experience became, through the song, available to anyone who pressed play. That is what Kurt Cobain did with his pain. He converted it. He put it through the machine of his extraordinary talent and turned it into something that other people could use. Teenagers in suburban America who had never been near Aberdeen, who had no experience of logging towns or divorce or homelessness, heard Something in the Way and recognized something. Something they couldn't name, something that had been in them and unnamed until a voice from a scratchy guitar track in Seattle gave it a sound. Lithium, the ecstatic, surging anthem about holding on to religion as a coping mechanism for depression, came from the same place. Kurt had lived briefly with a devout Christian family in Aberdeen, and he wrote about the experience of watching faith function as an emotional anchor, as a source of meaning in the absence of other sources of meaning, with a curiosity that was not mocking but genuine. He understood why a person would reach for that. He had been reaching his whole life, for something, for anything, that would make the interior weather manageable. All Apologies, the quiet, devastating closing track of In Utero, the 1993 album, is a song that asks, repeatedly, in various formulations, what else should I be? All apologies. What else could I say? Everyone is gay. The lyric is deliberately opaque, deliberately plural in its possible meanings. But the emotional center of it is clear. The exhaustion of a person who has been trying to figure out what they are supposed to be, what version of themselves the world will accept, for so long that the trying itself has become the predominant experience of existence. All apologies. It is what the boy on the bedroom wall was writing when he rhymed about hating mom and hating dad. It is what the man at the unplugged recording was expressing when he decorated the stage with white lilies and black candles. It is what the note to Boda was articulating, the culmination of a life of apology, of feeling that one's existence required constant justification, constant performance, constant proof that the space occupied was earned. He was one of the most gifted artists the rock and roll form has ever produced. His melodic instinct was extraordinary, the ability to write a verse that feels deliberately difficult and then release it into a chorus that is so cathartic it can make a listener cry without knowing why. His lyrical intelligence operated at a level that far exceeded the casual observation that his delivery sometimes obscured. His guitar playing was, in its own anti-virtuosic way, exactly as precise as the songs required. Never more than necessary, always exactly right. And underneath all of it, the gift, the catalog, the cultural revolution of Nevermind, the unplugged performance that may be the greatest single recorded live performance in rock history, was a boy who had written on his bedroom wall in Aberdeen about hating and being hated and the sadness of it, and who never found, in 27 years of life, the person or the place or the practice that could adequately address what that wall said. Revelation number 4. The system failed him at every level. This is the fourth revelation, the one that changes how you look at everything that came before. We talk about Kurt Cobain's death as if it were inevitable, as if the 27 Club, the cluster of rock musicians who died at that age, represents some tragic but natural law of the universe, some gravitational pull that genius and excess together create toward early termination. It was not inevitable. It was the outcome of a series of failures, by medicine, by the music industry, by the rehabilitation and mental health systems of the early 1990s, by the culture that consumed his art without attending to the artist, that were identifiable, avoidable, and in some cases already identified. He had found a treatment that addressed his stomach pain, buprenorphine. He wrote about it working. He described months without a stomach episode. He said it was the best thing he had ever tried for the condition that had driven him to heroin in the first place. The treatment was stigmatized out of accessibility to him by the very systems that were supposed to help him get sober. A medication that is now considered the gold standard of opioid use disorder treatment, openly prescribed, widely available, empirically validated, was unavailable to him as a legitimate part of recovery because of the cultural attitudes of 1993 and 1994. The Rome incident, which was serious enough to send him into a coma, resulted in a hospitalization and a return home. No extended, comprehensive care plan. No adjustment to the level of support around him. A return to the same environment, with the same pressures and the same chronic physical pain, because the systems around him were not designed to address what he was actually dealing with. They were designed to address a more generic version of addiction that didn't account for the specific medical, psychological, and circumstantial complexity of his situation. The intervention of March 25, 1994, was organized with genuine love and genuine fear. But an intervention, by its nature, asks a person to receive care in the format that other people have decided is appropriate. And Kurt Cobain had spent his entire life fighting against the experience of being told by other people what he was supposed to be, how he was supposed to exist, what form his authentic self was supposed to take. The intervention, whatever its participants intended, was experienced by him as another version of the pressure that had been building since the divorce in 1975. He lasted 2 days in the Exodus facility before he left. The facility's design, like most residential rehabilitation programs of that era, did not accommodate the specific situation of a person with chronic physical pain, a documented history of trauma beginning in childhood, and a philosophical commitment to autonomy that made standard therapeutic frameworks feel like a kind of violence. None of this diminishes the tragedy of what happened. It deepens it, because the tragedy is not simply that a gifted person died too young. The tragedy is that a gifted person died having been surrounded, in his final weeks, by people who loved him and systems that were trying to help him, and that the love and the systems both fell short of the specific gap between what he needed and what the world had available to offer. He asked for peace. He spent 27 years asking, in his journals and his songs, and his note to Buddha, for the particular peace of a person who is no longer required to be anything for anyone, who can simply exist in the warmth that his mother Wendy had once provided in Aberdeen before the divorce reorganized the world, without performance and without apology. He was failed by a childhood that broke something before he knew it could break. He was failed by a medical system that treated his symptoms without addressing their source. He was failed by an industry that needed him to keep being Kurt Cobain in the full commercial sense of that identity at the precise moment when being Kurt Cobain in that sense was killing him. And he was failed, in the end, by the limits of what help looked like in 1994. Before the understanding of trauma-informed care, before buprenorphine was accessible, before the specific intersection of chronic pain and addiction and early childhood trauma had been mapped in the ways that medical and psychological research has mapped it since. He was 27 years old. He had been carrying the Aberdeen wound for 19 of those years. He had been famous for 3 of them. The fame gets most of the narrative attention. The 19 years of carrying the wound are where the story actually lives. Aberdeen, One More Time, 1210, East 1st Street, Aberdeen, Washington. The house is still there. It has been painted yellow. It has been registered as a cultural heritage site, which is a complicated honor. The formal acknowledgement that a building matters because of what it held, rather than because of what it was. It is a small house. The kind of house that working-class families in small Pacific Northwest towns lived in during the 1960s. Not without dignity, not without warmth, but marked by the specific quality of a life conducted without surplus, without safety margin, with the understanding that things could get harder before they got better. In that house, a boy discovered music. In that house, a boy wrote on his bedroom wall about hating his parents, about the sadness of it, about the specific loneliness of a child caught between two people who were hurting each other and who didn't have the resources to protect him from what that felt like. In that house, something began that would eventually produce Nevermind and Smells Like Teen Spirit, and the unplugged performance and 30 million records sold, and a generation of musicians who came after and still cite him as the reason they picked up a guitar. The music was the gift, and the gift came from the wound. And the wound was never healed, despite the fame and the records and the people who loved him and the treatments that almost worked, and the daughter who was reason enough to stay. The wound was never healed because the wound was made in a place that is hard to reach, in the early psychology of a child who learned that love was conditional, and who spent 27 years looking for evidence that it wasn't, and who found that evidence most purely in the music, in the songs, in the 3-minute pieces of emotional truth that still land today, with a directness that 30 years have not diminished. He gave all of it to the music, and the music gave it to the world. And the world listened and felt understood and called him the voice of a generation. And somewhere inside that, the boy who had written on the wall in Aberdeen kept looking for the thing that the voice, for all its power, could not reach back and give him. The thing he wrote to Boda about. Peace. What remains? Frances Bean Cobain was 19 months old when her father died. She has grown up largely outside of public life, a choice that requires, given who her father was, active and deliberate effort. She has spoken about him occasionally in interviews and through her own creative work. She has described the complex experience of loving someone she barely knew, of being connected to an enormous legacy through the most intimate possible bond, of carrying a name that belongs to her and also to the world. She is, by her own accounts, doing the work that her father could not fully do. The slow, imperfect, necessary work of understanding what happened in the childhood, what it cost, and how to live in the aftermath without letting the cost define everything that follows. Kurt Cobain has been dead for more than 30 years. Nevermind has been in print and in circulation for more than 30 years, selling steadily, being discovered by new listeners, being cited by new generations of musicians who were not yet born when it was released. It is not a nostalgia artifact. It is not a museum piece. It is a living record, a collection of songs that still function the way they were designed to function, still reaching into rooms and finding the thing in the listener that responds to what the voice is transmitting. That is the extraordinary thing about what he made. The wound became art. The art survived. The world can still access, through the headphones or the speakers or the vinyl pressing, the specific emotional truth of what it felt like to be carrying the Aberdeen fracture through the fog of the Pacific Northwest in the years before anyone was paying attention. The boy who needed Boda is still there, in the music, still honest, still reaching for the thing that the music could briefly provide, still giving it to anyone who listens. He is 27 years old forever, and the songs are still singing. This is Fame and Shadows, the space between the stage and the person who stands on it, between the legacy and the life, between what the world heard and what the man was actually saying. If something in Kurt Cobain's story reached you today, if you recognize something in the gap between the person who performs and the person who simply needs to rest, then this channel was built for you. We don't tell these stories for the mythology. We tell them because behind every famous name is a human being carrying something that the spotlight was never designed to see. And those stories deserve to be told with honesty and care, and the understanding that peace, the thing he asked for at the end, was never too much to want. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell. Fame and Shadows.